Okay. Just starting the Lucifer code. And here we go. Yeah. Looks like we're set. I think we're live. Yes. Jahis?
Yeah.
I'm just about to start. Francesca and Beth, you guys ready?
Yeah.
Awesome. Hello, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Mohammed Abu Ghazala, Program and Communications Manager at the Jerusalem Fund, and I'm very excited to be opening up today's event. 10 days ago, November 29th, marked 75 years since the United Nations passed Resolution 181, calling for a partition of the land of Palestine between a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. Israel emerged out of the Partition Plan as a viable and cohesive state at the direct expense and rights of the indigenous, at the direct expense of the rights of the indigenous Palestinian nation. Since 1977, the UN General Assembly has commemorated this day as the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People, which continues to serve as an annual reminder to the international community of the continued denial of Palestinians' inalienable rights to self-determination, sovereignty, and return. It is in the spirit of this day and building on our annual conference, 75 Years of Partition, Ethnic Cleansing and Dispossession, that we are bringing two preeminent experts on the matter for a discussion that feels particularly relevant to our current moment, where more than 160 Palestinians have been killed by Israel in the West Bank so far this year, the most in any year since the Second Intifada. And today it also happens to be the 35th anniversary of the First Intifada, so it seems like a very appropriate time to have these sorts of discussions. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Edmund Gharib, who will in turn introduce to you our speakers and moderate today's symposium. Dr. Edmund Gharib is the senior scholar at the Palestine Center, an internationally recognized expert on the Middle East, Kurds, Iraq, and media issues. Dr. Gharib was the first Mustafa Barzani Scholar of Global Kurdish Studies at American University. He taught at George Washington University as well as University of Virginia, Georgetown University in DC and Qatar, and McGill University. He is the author of 12 books on topics including the Gulf War, Kurds, Iraq, media, the new media revolution in the Middle East and the Arab world, and US media coverage of the Middle East as well. He is also a frequent commentator and analyst for numerous outlets, including the Associated Press, BBC, Al Hurra, and Al Jazeera, and is regularly interviewed by American, European, Arab, and Asian media outlets. Dr. Gharib, please take it away.
Thank you, Mohammed. Welcome, Ms. Francesca and Professor Elizabeth. It's a pleasure for me to have you with us today, to have such prominent and very knowledgeable experts on this topic. I would like to briefly tell the audience a little bit about each of them. Ms. Francesca Albanese was appointed as the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories, which have been occupied since 1967 by the Human Rights Council at its 49th session in March of 2022. And she has taken up her function as of May 1st, 2022. She is a lawyer by training, specialized in human rights issues. Albanese is an affiliate scholar of the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University, as well as a senior advisor on migration and forced displacement for the think tank Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development. She has published widely on the legal situation in Israel and Palestine, and regularly teaches and lectures on international law and as well as on forced displacement at universities in Europe and the Arab region. Ms. Albanese has also worked as a human rights expert for the United Nations, including the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the UN Relief and Works Agency for the Palestinian Refugees. Professor Elizabeth Ferris is a research professor with the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown at the School of Foreign Service, and is an adjunct professor in the Georgetown Law School. She has served as senior advisor to the UN General Assembly Summit for Refugees and Migrants in New York, and as an expert advisor to the UN High-Level Panel on Internal Displacement. From 2006 to 2015, she was a senior fellow and co-director of the Brookings LSE project on internal displacement, where she worked to support understanding and protection of internally displaced persons. Prior to joining Brookings, she spent 20 years working in the field of humanitarian assistance, mainly in Geneva. And she has also served as the director of Church World Service in the Council of Churches and in the Church World Service Immigration and Refugee Program. Professor Ferris has also been writing extensively on refugee, migration, and humanitarian issues, including the politics of protection, which he's going to be talking to us about today, the limits of humanitarian action, consequences of chaos, and serious humanitarian crisis, as well as the failure to protect. That's the title of the book she wrote with Professor Kemal Kürsi, who is at Brookings. He's a Turkish professor. Her latest book, Refugees, Migration, and Global Governance, Negotiating the Global Compacts with Catherine Donato, was published by Routledge in 2019. It's a pleasure for me and a privilege to have you both here. And please go ahead and begin. I know that you want to speak briefly. Ms. Albanese, you wanted to talk about the situation on the ground and background of your report that you had, and that has created a lot of controversy. We'll talk about that during the question and answer. And then Professor Ferris will talk to us about the issue of protection. And then I'll have a few questions, and then we'll open it to our audience. Let me remind the audience to please send your questions, and when you have any, and we'll take it from there. Ms. Albanese.
Okay. Good evening, friends, colleagues. Actually, I should say good afternoon for those of you in the US. I wish to extend my gratitude to the Jerusalem Fund for organizing this timely discussion on a relevant topic for all Palestinians, and all the more for bringing me here tonight with my distinguished colleague, a scholar whom I feel much indebted to, Professor Ferris. I suggested to start this discussion, but with some general observations on the situation on the ground, since we are talking of international protection in connection to the occupied Palestinian territory. And as I'm here in my capacity as a special rapporteur, I should start with what I've observed over the past 6 months, and also based on the work of my predecessor and my own experience. I can certainly say that the occupied Palestinian territory is a microcosm of abuses, where the prevailing climate is of generalized, widespread, systemic, institutionalized violence, constituting, as the UN Secretary General said a few years ago, a coercive environment where most human rights are suspended or clearly violated. Numerous are the breaches of international law, including peremptory norms of international law. For those of the audience who are not lawyers, a peremptory norm of international law is a provision that can never be derogated, can never be violated, is stronger than any other norm. And such is the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Now, many of the violations that take place in the occupied Palestinian territory may amount to war crimes, like, for example, the deliberate targeting of civilians, the willful killing, the unlawful deportation and mass transfer of protected person, the deprivation of the rights to a fair trial in the context of mass arrest and detention. And there are recurrent forms of collective punishment and house demolition or orders of confinement are some of them. Highly reported, especially in recent years, has been a prima facie crime of apartheid, on which there is a wall-to-wall consensus among human rights actors in Israel and Palestine. But of course, there is also the issue of and it's less scrutinized, crime of aggression, which emanates from the annexation of the occupied territory or the imposition of a blockade on Gaza. Now, this situation is not recent. This is the result of a prolonged occupation that has lasted for 55 years. And 55 years is much beyond what should be considered as a reasonable length, reasonable duration for any military occupation. My first assessment, which was presented in my first report to the General Assembly this year, is that the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory, which has lasted 55 years, is not just illegal, as my predecessor, Professor Michael Link, said, because it's not temporary, it's administered in bad faith and involving systematic violation of humanitarian and human rights laws to the detriment of the Palestinians inhabitants. So it's also discriminatory in nature. But as I add on this, it's also illegal because it's engineered to violate, to prevent the realization of the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people. The right of self-determination is the right of all people to exist as a people, is the right of all rights, the right of the collective right par excellence. And so I say that Israel prevents the realization of this right in 4 ways: by preventing first and foremost territorial sovereignty, which is violated through seizure, annexation, and fragmentation of the Palestinian territory under occupation. Second, by preventing independent economic development, by exploiting, pillaging, and de facto monopolizing the natural resources, water, land, quarries, oil, gas, for the benefit of colonies and third parties. Third, by preventing cultural development, which Israel violates by continuously attempting to erase, attack, and suppress any expression of Palestinian national existence, identity, and unity. And fourth, preventing the formation of an independent political will, which is the beating heart of self-determination, which is violated by preventing the emergence of a cohesive Palestinian political leadership through the systematic, over the years, extrajudicial killings, mass imprisonment, and criminalization of a broad variety of people, including political actors, journalists, even teachers, religious leaders, increasingly human rights defenders and civil society. This aims to repress any political activity, advocacy, and activism. This is what I have documented. And this eventually pursues the Palestinianization of the occupied territory, controlling its native and refugee population. It's worth remembering that 40% of the Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory, West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, are refugees from 1947, 48, when Israel was created. So this I conclude in the report, has the hallmark of settler colonialism. This is the context in which we operate, and we should have in mind when envisaging solutions. Well, what international protections means in the case of the Palestinians need to take this framework in mind. So I thought it was useful to kick off a more technical discussions.
Thank you very much. Professor Faris, please go ahead.
Well, Oh, thank you. And it's great to be with you today and to share the stage or the screen with my colleague, Francesca. I thought I would step back from the compelling context that Francesca has just described and talk about the first term and the title of this session, that is international protection. You know, what that means in international law, how it's been applied, and how it should be used in the case of Palestinians. You know, maybe just to say at the beginning, the word protection is a nice word. You know, it conveys caring for, taking care of. The Oxford Dictionary defines it in ordinary issues to defend or guard from danger, to support against hostile action, to preserve from attack, persecution, harassment, to keep safe, to take care of, to shield from attack or change. And yet, as we'll see over the years, this term protection has evolved to cover many different activities that aren't obviously falling within the context of keeping safe or shielding from attack. Under international law, governments are responsible for protecting people living on their territories. It's fundamental to sovereignty and really the basis of our whole international regime. The situation arises, though, of people who do not enjoy the protection of their government, and that's where international protection comes in. Most obviously, this is the case for refugees, where the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is mandated to provide, quote, international protection and seek permanent solutions for refugees. That responsibility for UNHCR has expanded over the years. It's codified in the 1951 Refugee Convention, various regional conventions. You know, there's a clear understanding that the international community has a responsibility to protect people who don't have the protection of their government. Another group that requires international protection are stateless persons who don't enjoy the protection of any government. And we see a couple of international conventions on statelessness, although neither has been widely ratified, that provide some tools for protecting people. And the General Assembly has asked UNHCR to take on the mandate of providing protection to stateless people, which they're trying to do by reducing statelessness generally and offering some administrative type solutions. Under international humanitarian law, the provisions are starkly clear for the protection of civilians in situations of conflict and occupied territories. You know, the occupying power has a responsibility to protect those living within the occupied territory. The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, has long been involved in protecting civilians in situations of armed conflict, whether international, national, internal, and so on. Since 2000, the term protection of civilians has become central to a lot of the work of the UN Security Council, at least in its statements and resolutions, if not always in practice. We see, for example, that protection of civilians is included in almost all mandates of peacekeeping operations. They're there not just to keep the peace between warring parties, but to protect civilians in those areas. In 2005, the responsibility to protect concept was affirmed by the UN General Assembly at the World Summit. You know, and in this case, there's a recognition that when governments fail to protect their people, the international community has a responsibility to intervene, at least in four situations of mass atrocity: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. I mean, in practice, I think the utility of the concept of responsibility to protect has been tarnished by the fact that it's been used to perhaps justify other political actions, such as regime change. So there's clearly this widespread understanding that there are certain situations where people do not enjoy the protection of their government, where the international community has to respond. Over the last 10 or 15 years, the interest in protection has just skyrocketed. And increasingly, humanitarian agencies have stepped into the void. You know, if political actors or military actors can't protect civilians, then by golly, humanitarian agencies will try to do so. UNHCR mainly works through providing legal protection to refugees to protect them from being sent back to a place where their life is in danger, or to guarantee that they have the possibility of exercising their fundamental human right of asking for asylum in other countries. Humanitarian agencies, though, have taken the concept of protection further, now defining it as all activities and ensuring full respect for the rights of the individual in accordance with relevant bodies of law. So protection can include a lot of different activities. What we see in practice, though, is certainly the erosion of this concept of international protection. If you look at what's happening with refugees around the world, you see that governments, particularly the same governments that drafted the Refugee Convention, that set up a system of international protection, are undermining that system by restricting the ability of people to even reach borders and ask for protection as refugees. I mean, you see this in U.S. policy on our southern border with Title 42 and migration protection protocols. You see it with Libya and Turkey, and deals being made to prevent people from reaching territory to ask for protection. So let's talk then about where international protection of Palestinian refugees falls in this landscape. You know, first of all, clearly it's the responsibility of the Israeli authorities to protect everyone living in the occupied territories. That seems clear. There are dozens, probably hundreds of reports and General Assembly resolutions affirming that this is a fundamental responsibility which has not been accepted by the Israeli government. In the failure of the international community to protect Palestinians, once again, humanitarian action has been used to try to fill this void. We see humanitarian action sometimes as a kind of band-aid to patch over conflicts when the political parties cannot agree on resolving the conflict. This was the case in Bosnia. I think it's the case in Syria. You can't stop the conflict, but by golly, you can help those who are victims of the conflict. UNRWA, you know, I think is an amazing UN agency that provides a full range of services to Palestinian refugees throughout its 5 areas of operation. But Palestinians were explicitly excluded from the mandate of UNHCR, and UNRWA was explicitly excluded from having a protection mandate for Palestinians. Now, individual UNRWA staff have done amazing work in trying to advocate for and protect Palestinians living within their territory, but it doesn't fall formally within its mandate, and as such, UNRWA has been limited in what it can do. Back in 2018, the UN Secretary General offered a report on the protection of Palestinians. Actually, I think, Francesca, you cited it in your recent report to the General Assembly. I went back and looked at that report, and he said, number one, the best way to protect Palestinians is through negotiation of a comprehensive, just, and lasting settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict. He then goes on to talk about different kinds of protection. First, mentioning military, deploying armed forces to protect people in situations of conflict. Francesca included a recommendation in her October report to the General Assembly to, quote, deploy an international protective presence. I hope we can talk about that in just a minute. The 2018 SG report says this is limited by the fact that a UN force would require the consent of the parties involved, which would probably be unlikely in the case of Israel and deployment of an international protective presence. Secondly, talks about legal protection. UN, ICRC can continue to advocate with authorities for the protection of individuals or groups. That is happening. It's happening all the time. It's clearly insufficient to protect Palestinians. Third, talks about general assistance to help people cope with the effects of occupation. Again, we have UNRWA underfunded as it is, doing tremendous work trying to assuage the harms that are caused by the lack of international protection. And then publicity is mentioned, presence of international media reports. But, we've had thousands of reports on the human rights situation of Palestinians, on the lack of protection. And yet, reports or publicity without action doesn't really protect people. And so the question I have, which I'm happy to turn over to Francesca to answer, is, what other tools are there to provide protection to Palestinian refugees, given Israel's refusal to abide by international humanitarian law and assert the responsibility that it has under that law?
Well, thank you very much for this presentation. It's very informative, very thoughtful. I'd like to ask you both, actually. Yesterday, I think it was the Guardian issue that had an article in which it said that the situation on the ground in Palestine is reaching the point of boiling. Winston also warned about this and said this was the bloodiest year since probably around 2005, and that over 200 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank and about 30 Israelis. And it seems that the situation is becoming much more explosive. The Palestinian people are becoming much more frustrated. Yesterday, there was an article also that Jonathan Cook, a British journalist, wrote, in which he said that the Palestinians under occupation, they find it hard to imagine a situation growing more wretched or Israel's rule of law more of a charade. They already face armed religious extremist settlers, confident their violence will go unpunished by the Israeli authorities, invoking the deeds from the Bible to justify stealing ever more Palestinian land. Israel and its settler population already have complete control over more than 60% of the West Bank. But now the settlers are actually in a much stronger position with the new government in Israel and the role of Ben Gvir and the new authority that seems to be given to him and to his one of his allies, that this is making the situation much more difficult, much more desperate for the Palestinian, and that this is going to be extremely dangerous and might lead to more violence. I would like to hear your reactions to, first of all, what has been happening recently. Do you agree with the point that the Guardian, Mr. Thor Wiesland, and Jonathan Cook, as well as others, have made? And what do you think the UN and the international community should be doing at this stage? Is there something that they ought to be doing? I mean, we have seen these excellent reports that have been presented, for example, that Francesca Albassini's report and the report of the International Commission of Inquiry, and over the years there have been other reports, although these have been much more, I think some of them had a wider or more freedom to do investigation. And it seemed all these reports, the report that Francesca did, as well as the report that Thor Wiesland did, as well as the Commission of Inquiry, appear to be solidly based. They have done a lot of homework, a lot of research. They interviewed a lot of people, yet it does not seem to be going anywhere. I would like to hear your reaction. To what extent do you feel that this is true, and what should be done, what could be done in this area?
Yeah, I think Francesca should answer both in terms of what's happening on the ground and really talk about, what we can do to better protect people beyond writing brilliant reports.
Yes, that's the challenge. And thank you, Beth. And thank you, Edmund. I take the liberty to call each other by names. But let's start from the question, because it was great for me listening to Beth going to the salient points of the Secretary General report of 2018, because then I can use, let's say, the skeleton she shared to give my sense of what it would mean today for the Palestinians. But let's start by the question of where we are today and whether the situation has reached a boiling point. I do think that the situation is of an unprecedented gravity by simply looking at the numbers, because the numbers of Palestinians killed inside the occupied Palestinian territory, and there are also, I think, 6 Israelis. So there are 250 Palestinians in the total of the occupied territory. 250 in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Sorry, 200 in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and then 50 from this summer 3-day war in Gaza. And yes, 6 Israelis in the occupied territory, and plus about 30 Israelis inside Israel. So again, these do not follow the letter, they do not follow under my mandate, but these are figures that are out there, and every life counts, frankly. We cannot consider what's going on in Israel as separated from the OPT. I don't think that it would be fair to comment on this situation in isolation. We got there because of a protracted impunity. I fully agree with what Beth said. This is not a complex situation. In fact, it's a situation that could be resolved by applying international law, like in any dispute. I contend the use of the word conflict to describe the relationship between the Israel and Palestine, because I think conflict made sense in the context of the regional balance or lack of balance that has existed for decades after 1948, meaning the Arab-Israeli conflict or Israel-Arab conflict. But the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian is a prolonged occupation marked by significant conflictuality, punctuated by conflicts. Now, in this condition, in this situation, keeping an entire population, 40% of whom are refugees, and all of whom are to be considered under international law as stateless, because the state of Palestine exists, but until it can exercise fully its sovereignty in the form of independence, its trajectory. It's a project born in captivity, so it cannot really manifest by ensuring the protection.
It appears we're having some problems.
Are you with us, Francesca?
Impunity and the violations, the international community recommends negotiation. And here I go to the report of the Secretary General, which I find very useful, fascinating, and this is why I recommend, and this moves to the second part of the question. So what can be done? I think that report contains important suggestions, but there is some adjustment to be made. First of all, negotiation. I don't think that it's fair and even legal to ask an occupied population, which is under a regime of colonial practices, to negotiate the conditions of its subjugation, because they lack the capacity to negotiate. They are subjugated. So first, there should be the realization of their self-determination. So end of military occupation as a precondition to negotiate. And then they negotiate as two states if this two-state solution keeps on moving. Now it's just the status quo. It's of one apartheid state with a very, very difficult regime difficult to explain regime of an occupation that has morphed into a very brutalizing practice for those under occupation. And so the second question is the deployment of a military presence. Agreed. I mean, so far it's been impossible. This has been requested over and over, including by the Palestinians, but there has been the veto of the Security Council, and of course there is no possibility to have the consent of Israel. But again, here we shouldn't be thinking of a conflict area. It's an occupation which violates the right of self-determination, so some coercive measures should be considered. And the concept of legal protection, this is where we need to insist the most, because I think that this is where the UN and all the humanitarian operators need to shift a little bit their gears, in the sense protection, as Beth was saying, is to do anything that allows the exercise of the fundamental rights of the people entitled to international protection. But first and foremost, there is the principle of do no harm. So because the occupation is unlawful, and again, there will be soon, hopefully, an advisory opinion rendered, if the General Assembly confirms its vote, rendered by the ICJ on the consequences of an illegal occupation, including responsibilities of third states. But so the idea is how, while under an illegal situation, humanitarian assistance is needed, and so it won't be affected by the unlawfulness of the situation. At the same time, I think that the rules of engagement need to change, because Israel has increasingly passed draconian laws, draconian regulations that operate as if it was the sovereign state, that this goes unchallenged. Again, it's inconceivable. So this should be challenged. And it also trickles down into what it is humanitarian protection. Humanitarian assistance is needed. I will not dismiss it. And especially the work of OCHA in the OPT is fundamental, because it's documenting and monitoring. It's really being the eyes and ears, together with UNRWA and other organizations, of the UN on the ground. At the same time, humanitarian aid can never be a substitute for a political solution, which is what is needed here. A political solutions, again, as Beth said, in line with international law. And publicity will never work until we keep on parsing our words and addressing the symptoms instead of the root causes. It's very important to get out of this tendency to comment on the individual violations of the occupations. This is why my first report pointed at the context, which is not just one of apartheid, as it has been denounced for 2 years now, and by my predecessor, but it's one of a settler colonial endeavor. Unless we get it clear in mind and the General Assembly starts to address the Israeli occupation as such, it will be difficult to provoke that shift in the decision-making realm that will allow to use international law to regulate and reorient politics.
I think this is a very, very important point, and we're seeing some changes on the ground. We're seeing changes in, for example, the three reports that have recently come out have been much more succinct, addressed the issues, discussed really and pointed to what's really going on the ground. Even in the United States, after the Gaza war, on the popular level, for the first time, we're beginning to see, for example, groups such as Latin Americans, African Americans, churches, as well as even Asian Americans for the first time expressed their criticism. We've heard a number of them speaking of what's going on the ground, describing it as apartheid. Yet at the same time, we have also seen, like the former Prime Minister of Israel, Lapid, has accused you of, because of your report, of anti-Semitism. They have also accused the other report, the people who are involved. They're saying they are trying to delegitimize Israel. At the same time that we see, for example, a lot of movement when the Ukrainian situation, and deservedly so. We see that there's aid, economic aid, financial aid, military aid. In fact, more money has been given than the military budget of Russia, the annual military budget of Russia. The issue is raised time and again, and there's regular activity. And the same thing happens with some of the other issues, Iran, for example, Syria, and Uyghurs, and China. And yet, when it comes to the Palestinian issue, we don't see a response. What do you think are some of the main reasons for this? I mean, of course, this charge of anti-Semitism is in part, it is an attempt to divert attention from the real issue. Let me ask you one question specifically on that, Francesca and Professor Ferris as well, is, did the Israelis deny any of the conclusions of your report, for example? And why is it that we haven't seen more action by members of the international community?
I might start. I mean, I think one of the problems is that the Palestinian situation has gone on for so long, and there are so many new crises that it's hard to sustain attention for any humanitarian crisis. You remember a year ago, all the attention was on Afghanistan, and that's ended. It's all now on Ukraine. I think they're just limited attention span. I think there's also a perception that, oh, it's just all political or nothing can be done. Maybe a feeling of helplessness of watching the impunity and realizing how little the calls for action have yielded concrete results for Palestinians. I think we probably needed some kind of a new media strategy on how to present and explain what's happening. I was excited, Francesca, in your report by your emphasis on self-determination. That's kind of a different angle for looking at the Palestinian situation. Maybe it will attract a different kind of supporter than those who were, weary of hearing about Palestine for 55 years with little prospects for change.
It's interesting, Beth, because in fact, it seems a new concept, but in fact, until 30 years ago, and it's such a long time, it's more than one generation. So 1 generation and a half. So until 30 years ago, the question of the overall question of Palestine was framed as one of self-determination. So many international law provisions, including some concerning the crime of aggression, have been developed with the question of Palestine in mind, as much as IHL has developed also on the shoulders of the Palestinians very much so since the late 40s. So it has changed trajectory. The debate has changed rhythm and trajectory with the Oslo process, because the Oslo process gave this, and I like the way that you mentioned perception of intractability, because Oslo gave the perception that the conflict had been resolved. Then peace processes consolidated with Jordan, and then it developed. The intense Arab boycott toward Israel started to fade, because if the Palestinians were dealing with Israelis, why wouldn't other Arab states? And so there has been this sense that the Palestinians had achieved their self-determination, therefore through statehood. And therefore, if it was not fully achieved, it was because the Palestinians were not able to get their acts together. Sorry to be very blunt, but this is the perception, and I've sensed it through my work, and this is why I decided to go back. In a way, bring the camera back to focus on where the question has remained critical, although the debate has derailed. I agree with you. There is an attention span in the international community. And frankly, unlike other similar situations like in Tibet or in Western Sahara, where self-determination for the people of these countries has not been achieved, the question of Palestine has still remained high in the media in relative terms, of course. But it's difficult, as you say, to sustain maintain that tension, especially when there is, and I couldn't stress it more, when there is a constant propaganda trying to provoke an inversion, of the terms of the discussion. So the victims here are projected as the perpetrators, and there is this continuous erosion of the space to entertain and candid and honest debate about the situation on the ground, which is hijacked by anti-Semitism. Of course, I think that, for me, it's normal now. I don't expect to receive anything else by many than these accusations, these allegations of anti-Semitism. But again, it doesn't hurt anymore as it used to, because it's just a tactic to deflect the attention from what I'm trying to say. Is it anti-Semitic because anti-Semitism is discriminating a Jew because he or she is a Jew? So it has many manifestations. I'm certainly not, I don't want to engage on this, but I want to say, what does it have to do with the performance of Israel? There are Jewish people around the world. Israel behaves in a way that is not compliant with international law. And I criticize that, and I advocate for respect of international law and accountability. Does it make an anti-Semitic of me? I don't think so. But also we should really question what is happening to the international system when it's strangled by prejudice to a point that it doesn't function anymore. And you can see that you were asking, Edmund, why the international community is so averse to take concrete steps to advance international law, as it has been done in other contexts, not necessarily successfully all the time, but at least here there is no excuse. It's clear that there is double standards and exceptionalism. I've always thought that it was because of internal just American politics influencing international politics. And then I thought that, for example, in Europe, there was a lack of fully processed sense of guilt toward the Jewish people for the horrors that they have been subjected to, and not just the Holocaust. The Jewish people have been mistreated and discriminated against and persecuted for centuries, even before the Holocaust. The Holocaust is the culmination of that horror. So, for a long time, I thought, oh, maybe it's because of that sense of guilt. Today, I don't think so. I don't think it's just that. There is a clear self-interest in the way the international community and the most powerful states, which are still in the West, organize themselves, and it just, the Palestinians are caught in the middle. So it's very difficult, I think, for the West to lose Israel as an ally for a number of reasons. So look at the trade between Western states and Israel, but also, the trades between Israel and most of the world, of the security system, the spyware. These are things that we should be discussing. And these are things that I intend to investigate through the course of my mandate. And the last element that I would like to bring to the discussion, I would love to hear what Beth thinks, including of the international protection system, which she's rightly saying, it's being eroded, the protection for the refugees. Look at what happens. But I do think that there is, and this is something I'm researching myself, aside of the work I do as a special rapporteur, there is a clear pattern, a clear legacy of colonialism that persists, that remains and stains the system, which eventually is applied in a discriminatory fashion towards certain groups of refugees compared to others. And the Ukrainian cases has exposed clearly what I'm saying.
Professor Ferris, have any?
No, I mean, you're right. If you look at the overall refugee system, there are discrepancies galore between the amount of assistance given to some group by governments deciding to allow some refugees to come and stay and work for 3 years and to send others back or to not allow them to enter. There are clear discrepancies in the system. And I think it's interesting to look at Palestinians in the context of the broader refugee system. On the one hand, UNRWA provides, an incredible range of services that are not available to most of the world's refugees to have the possibility to go to school, past primary school. It's still only 20% of refugees globally have that possibility, or the quality of healthcare in UNRWA clinics compared to those most refugees have. And yet this lack of protection, this lack of an agency that is charged with protecting Palestinians is just a glaring disparity in the way Palestinians are treated compared with refugees elsewhere.
Let me follow up with a question for you, and that is, since you've talked a lot about protection, first of all, do you see any difference in the way UN or international organizations or the international community deal with the West Bank, a different way from Gaza? One of the points that Francesca mentioned, which I thought was very interesting, is the impact of the Oslo process. Could the Oslo process be an impediment, in fact, to realizing the international protection? What are the implications, in a way, that would, where we see for international protection, have for the Palestinian Authority and the West Bank, and also for Hamas in Gaza? I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Francesca.
Sorry, I couldn't understand the last part of the question concerning Gaza, Edmund. You are quite far. I don't know if it's my problem, but you're quite far from the microphone for me.
Sure. First of all, I was asking on the question, you mentioned, Francesca, the question of the Oslo process and how that may have been an impediment to the whole process, or for realizing international protection. This is what I wanted Professor Ferris to answer also, is that she agree with that perspective, that she agreed that the Oslo process may have an effect, but also is, how also, to what extent are the divisions, for example, among the Palestinians are also a factor, for example, between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority or Fatah. And I would like to hear your thoughts, since you have been working on this issue for a while. But the main issue I'm interested in also is has there been, and this is any difference in the way the West Bank has been dealt with by the UN from the way Gaza has been dealt with over the years?
Beth, would you like me to go first?
You go first, because I don't know. It's hard to talk about the impact of the Oslo Accord because it's dead. The process is dead. I don't know.
Yes. No, and probably you could. It would be very interesting to hear your thoughts also based on my interpretation of the current reality. So probably it helps us frame the discussion. So to be precise, what I said in the report is that the Oslo Agreement, reading the Oslo Accords, doesn't lead to think, oh, this was written with the full realization of Palestinian self-determination in the 22% that remains of British Mandate Palestine, because it's not. The Oslo Accords were an interim accord, where for 5 years, for a 5 year period, leading to autonomy. And people thought that this would, in fact, there were many who were elated at the time, because they said, okay, this is to start de-escalating the tension with the Israelis, and then we will move on to negotiate the most like thorny issues, the question of borders and refugees and settlements. But in fact, again, I say this is the tricky part. The Oslo Accord, it's still a sort of living, but in a sort of life support because it has expired. At the same time, no agreement under international law, international agreements cannot be in breach of fundamental rights, especially a peremptory norm of international law. So the Oslo agreements would not be valid while Israel has used it as a vehicle to advance colonization, to advance fragmentation of the territory, and to pursue the repression of the Palestinian people as a polity and as a civic, in terms of civic space, really, where to live as a people. So based on this, let me go to the second question you have concerning the fragmentation, the internal fragmentation. I think that this is a function of 55 years of repression, which I've said since the very beginning, since 1967, Israel has engaged in land grabbing, transfer of civilians in the occupied Palestinian territory, which is a war crime, and it has committed extrajudicial killings. I mean, this is documented, including by Israeli scholars. It has engaged in extrajudicial killings and summary executions of a number of political leaders, not just those who were involved in the armed struggle, including intellectuals, people who were just seen as ideologically opposed to the occupation. And these, of course, and then the web has grown bigger and bigger to the point that the real persecution today, and this is horrific, is after the children. And you know the intergenerational trauma that such a very repressive occupation produces. I mean, of course we reached a boiling point because 3 generations, 4 generations born and bred under this system, how do you want them to see Israel? Seriously, what I've been seeing is a recipe for a perfect storm. And when it comes to the divisions between the internal division, Hamas versus Fatah, frankly, I think it's a function of the repression. We should not melt with internal Palestinian businesses, and we should not use it as an excuse not to deem the Palestinians responsible for their fate. The only responsibility the international community has, or rather the primary responsibility it has, because it's not the only one, is to ensure the right of self-determination. So the Israel moves the boots on the ground out of the occupied territory, and the blockade of Gaza is lifted. And why? This is why an international presence is to be the idea of an international presence that guarantees the safety and security of both Israelis and Palestinians is to be pursued. It seems so logical. Why not? Of course, the interest of Israel to protect its citizens is sacrosanct, and so is that of the Palestinians. So why not to accept to have an international objective, impartial presence?
Let me, some of our audience members have sent some questions, and they focus on some of the points that we've been talking about. But let me just let you know that it is. They're asking, what hope is there? This is about 2 people have asked for this. What hope is there for the situation to finally change? And I know that I've read actually a quote by you, Francesca, on this. You had expressed the hope that member states of the United Nations will walk the walk, as you said, and talk the talk of legality and morality. Otherwise, the image of the United Nations and of the international community is going to be tarnished. I thought that was a very powerful statement. So to answer the question that our audience members said, how do you think that this is likely to change? And there's another question that asks, in your experience, what are both of you, what are some positive drivers you have seen that it would indicate that we're likely to see change?
Maybe I'll start my very parochial experience as a professor at Georgetown. I've been teaching about refugees and Palestinian refugees for 10 years or so. And every year I sense that my students are more interested, they are more sympathetic, they're clearly not hopeless. They see the obvious injustice of the situation and seem to be taking it up in a way that 10 years ago, there wasn't that much interest. It was just one of those given. So I have a lot of hope in young people. I also have a lot of hope in the linking of these various struggles for justice, whether it's Palestinians or race or indigenous people or other factors. You see activists drawing connections in ways that I think is helpful. I'm not very optimistic about possibilities for a change of heart in Israel or a sudden compliance with international law, particularly not given the new administration. But, I do have hope in the activists. And I hope we're not at a boiling point. You use that term boiling point a lot in talking about the Middle East, tipping point, boiling point. We've heard that same phrase for years in different situations and contexts, and somehow it doesn't boil over. It continues to simmer on and cause a lot of pain. But maybe if it did boil over, whatever that means, that might trigger a different kind of response than we've seen so far.
Yeah, I like the fact that Beth starts with the youth, because this is often my response to the silver lining. I see a lot of change, like Beth. I see a lot of change, things that were not possible 15 years ago. I remember when I moved to the US, it was seriously, couldn't pronounce certain words. And now it's not just because of the work from human rights organizations. There is a greater receptivity, I would say, among let's say the Jewish communities, especially in the US. In Europe, I think there is still a way to go about that. But in the US, I see much more criticism toward the assumptions that were there, like untouchable, axiomatic truth for their fathers and mothers, for example. I see that the new generation is different and empathizes much more with the reality on the ground, sees much more and cannot unsee that. I think I share pessimism, at least in the short term, for what concerns the change happening from the ground. Because again, if we maintain that Israel is still a democracy in terms of process, meaning that the votes means something, I mean, the current constellation, political constellation, doesn't leave room for much hope, because it's as far right as ever, and there are Kahanists in the Knesset, so settlers with a very violent rhetoric, which is scary. It's scary not just for the people outside, it's scary for that part of the Israeli population which does not, and I'm not just talking of the Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, but of Jewish Israelis who do not recognize themselves in this system, who don't feel protected, who do not subscribe for the violations that are committed day in and day out against the Palestinians. And unfortunately, I also see, I don't have a full sense of it, but I'm carried out an sort of an investigation. I mean, I'm documenting things that are happening now for my next report. And I hear, especially academics with whom I've been working for years, that they're skeptical. And this is the first time I hear saying that. They're skeptical that the current the new generation of Palestinians, they are those who were born within the walled West Bank and the walled Gaza and the separated Jerusalem. So they have no interaction whatsoever with the Israeli people other than soldiers. So of course they have no empathy, and they are much more radicalized. But again, the situation is very different with the third generation Palestinians in the diaspora. And this is where my hope, if I can talk of hope, lies. And the positive drivers, again, I do believe in humanity and in the force of international law, but we need to make it happen. So we need to keep on exposing the wrongdoings and the wrongfulness of the reality on the ground.
We're getting close to our time, but let me ask you just one other question. Whoever wants to answer it, one or both. One of the things today, for example, there was an article in Axios saying that this is based on Israeli diplomatic reporting, and Israeli officials talking to Axios, saying that the United States government and American diplomats have asked the UN not to update the blacklist that includes American companies working on the West Bank. At the same time, the US says it's opposed to settlement. So I see that there's a contradiction here. I mean, how can we explain this? But what could be done to change this? And I think I'm glad you pointed out also to the fact that we're seeing also some a number of Jewish people in the United States and in Israel, Israeli organizations, American organizations, American students speaking, and American students voting when the BDS was voted upon at universities, including here in town. There's a significant number of Jewish students supporting. They were critical of Israel. Some human rights organizations in Israel also, Amnesty International here and Human Rights Watch. These are significant changes. But at the same time, when we see something like this, if this report is accurate, and it seems to be coming from the Israelis about the settlements, I mean, this in a way, people in the Middle East probably, or the Palestinians would think this is, it's almost hopeless. I mean, I would like to hear your thoughts, your comments, and what could we do? What could be done to influence U.S. policy on this issue, especially when we're talking a little about the Ukraine. There's a great deal of, and we hear a lot about the need to respect sovereignty, territorial integrity, and yet to support the idea of the Trump administration, and this has been carried on into the Biden administration, supported the annexation of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. Also the annexation of the Golan Heights. So basically that also raises questions, and I would like to hear any comments or thoughts from you on this before we close.
Beth, would you like to go first?
No, I'm not very hopeful. I hate to end on a pessimistic note, so maybe you have something hopeful to say. I'm not very hopeful about settlements or the Biden policy, or anyway. But hopefully you've got some more encouraging words, Francesca.
Well, on the settlements, I think that there is a lot of information that needs to be passed. One thing it's clear to me after living in the US is that like Beth, I also have limited hope that things are going to, oh no, sorry, Beth, you didn't say that. I thought you were saying that, but I have limited hope that the change will come from the policymakers themselves, because there is an entrenched bad habit to tolerate the intolerable. This is not unique to Israel. I think that there are many abusive regimes that are tolerated and even sheltered by protected by Western countries. So this is to be recognized. When it comes to Israel, I think that again there is a tendency to shield the country from criticism, that it's so ingrained. But at the same time, I said, after living in the US, I really appreciate how people react on things that they feel absolutely immoral, absolutely indefensible. And there is also this beautiful thing of this beautiful possibility, which is not very available to at least the Southern European, to contact your the people you have expressed your vote for, the people, your representative. I wouldn't even know who's my representative in Italy, because of the electoral system. I mean, the US, this is key. There is still a possibility to influence politics through the base, at least this, maybe I'm too optimistic and too hopeful, but I do believe that it's going to the change, like in bringing down apartheid South Africa. So the change will come from the civil society. Eventually, the state authorities were the last comers, not all of them. And I don't think it will be the same also for the case of Palestine. The non-aligned movement, which has always been very united on the case of Palestine, has become less and less cohesive and coherent in terms of policies. But this can be corrected. This is not difficult to fix. What is difficult to fix is, or to readjust, is the position of Western countries. And this is where I'm glad to know that there are vibrant civil societies, because this is where the difference can be made.
Well, thank you very, very much for this very thoughtful, perceptive analysis for both of you. We really appreciate you being here. I think this really helped us to understand what's going on to a certain extent. And I think you presented a realistic assessment. We really appreciate your comments and your thoughts. And thank you for being with us. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye, Beth.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Beth.
Bye. Bye, Edmund. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good day. Really appreciate it. And I saw your interview. I'm trying to remember who it was. And that was where you talked about, talking the talk and walking the walk. I thought that was very, very poignant, very powerful.
I will try to use it again.
Thank you.
Okay. Going back to the kids. Bye-bye.
Take care.